Hi there, I'm J.C.Hollywood. This is This Week in the 80s for the week beginning July 16th. While we suffer through the blue skies and unbearably reasonable temperatures of an Australian winter, let's spare a thought for the poor souls at Vostok Station in Antarctica, who on the 21st of July 1983 experienced the lowest temperature ever recorded in an inhabited area when the mercury dipped to a chilly minus 89.2 degrees Celsius. While we're remembering poor souls, let's spare a thought for those brave Americans who were born on July the 17th, 1966. Because they turned 18 on July the 17th, 1984, which just so happened to be the same day that the legal drinking age was raised from 18 to 21. The change, implemented when Ronald Reagan signed the Minimum Drinking Age Act, was implemented in an attempt to curb the sharp increase in drink driving related accidents that had been on the rise since the 60s. The National Institute of Health reported that in the 1970s, more than 2/3 of traffic accidents involving 16 to 20-year-olds also involved alcohol. Want to know the bad news? It worked. In 2013, the NIH reported that alcohol-related traffic deaths per population since the 80s had been halved. So I'm sorry to say, American teens, but you're going to have to continue to wait to get your drink on. On the 14th of May 1985, George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley released what would be their biggest hit as Wham! Wake Me Up Before You Go Go, and this week in 1984 it reached number 1 on the Australian charts. The song, allegedly inspired by a drunken note left by Ridgeley for his parents, was written by Michael as an ode to the pop songs of the 50s and 60s. While they'd had a couple of hits in the UK previously, it became their first number 1 hit in the UK, and the success followed around the world as it claimed top spot in Australia, the US, Canada, and it also topped the Euro chart. But just as Wham! Was starting to take off, the seeds of their demise were already being planted. A week after reaching number 1 in Australia, George Michael released his first solo single, Careless Whisper. Curiously, Careless Whisper was co-written by Ridgeley, whereas Wake Me Up Before You Go Go was not. While George Michael originally intended to maintain both acts, keeping Wham! For the teens while using his solo stuff to focus on a more soulful, adult-oriented market, the success of Careless Whisper showed that he could find success in that arena, and within a few years he would focus on that exclusively. A fun fact about the saxophone part for Careless Whisper: no, it wasn't played by Kenny G, but it was attempted by 10 other saxophonists before Steve Gregory managed to nail it just the way Michael wanted. The curious way in which some singles are released meant that in 1985, for 8 consecutive weeks, Madonna held the top spot in Australia with 3 songs released as 2 singles. Sounds confusing? I'll try to make some sense of it. Angel was the 3rd single off Madonna's 2nd studio album, Like a Virgin. And when the single was released in a 12-inch version in April 1985, it was paired with the song Into the Groove from her recently released film Desperately Seeking Susan. And while Into the Groove was technically a B-side, it was treated as a single on radio and television. And that meant that the paired single claimed top spot and stayed there for 4 weeks. The song that knocked it off? It was a song from a film called Vision Quest by an up-and-coming singer you may have heard of called Madonna. The song was Crazy for You, and this week it took top spot where it too remained for 4 weeks. 3 songs, 2 singles, 8 weeks. Simple, right? On July 21st, 1987, a band released an album that didn't do so good. A month later, it debuted on the Billboard charts at a nosebleeding 182. As it struggled its way to 200,000 in sales, the record label considered dumping it all together and cutting their losses. Fortunately, they didn't, because that album was Appetite for Destruction, and the band that released it was Guns N' Roses. Preceded by the single It's So Easy, Appetite for Destruction courted controversy from the start. The original album cover had to be replaced because of its graphic and gruesome content. It was replaced with a cross decorated with the 5 skulls of the band members. Maybe you've seen it. The album didn't feature a traditional A and B side, rather it had a G and an R side. The Guns side was for the violence and debauchery with songs like Welcome to the Jungle and Paradise City, where the Roses side was more romantic with songs like My Michelle and Sweet Child of Mine. More than a year after its release on August the 6th, 1988, the album clawed its way to the #1 spot on the Billboard charts, on the road to becoming the most successful debut album of any artist of all time. Some notable films released this week. 1981 gave us the Dudley Moore comedy classic Arthur. 1984 gave us arguably the second best frat movie ever made in Revenge of the Nerds. And 1987 gave us a great look into the future with RoboCop. July the 18th, 1986 gave us one of the greatest sequels ever made with James Cameron's Aliens. The idea for a sequel to the 1989 film Alien had been floated in the early 80s, and James Cameron was brought on to write a treatment for the sequel on the strength of a screenplay that he had in production for a film called The Terminator. That first attempt didn't generate much buzz and the project fizzled. But when reshoots for Conan the Destroyer forced the shooting schedule for The Terminator to be pushed back, James Cameron found himself with a little time on his hands and he threw himself into his Aliens pitch again. That second draft did the trick. The film upped the action and upped the jump scares. It opened to almost universal acclaim, and it set the template for all military badass films to follow. Okay, that is going to do it for this week. Thank you for joining me. Make sure you like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm J.C.Hollywood, and I'll see you back here next week for more This Week in the 80s.